The water was a cold shock, a violent baptism that stole the air from her lungs, but his arms were a furnace. They wrapped around her, strong and certain, lifting her from the turquoise depths as if she weighed nothing. Her ridiculous, drenched pink uniform, a cartoonish costume of servitude, clung to her skin like a second, shameful layer. Water streamed from her brown hair into her eyes, blurring the impossible sight before her. Julian Vance. He wasn't a phantom, not a myth whispered among the staff. He was real, solid muscle and warm skin, holding her in the middle of his ridiculously large swimming pool. His dark hair was slicked back, and droplets of water clung to his defined shoulders like tiny jewels in the hazy golden light of the late afternoon. Beyond him, a stone fountain cascaded with a gentle roar, the mist catching the sun. Near the edge of the pool, a wooden tray laden with perfect, untouched fruit floated aimlessly, a silent witness to her humiliation. And further still, standing with ramrod-straight posture, were two other maids in identical pink uniforms, their faces perfect masks of impassive shock. They looked like statues, part of the estate's curated perfection, while she was the chaotic, dripping flaw in the center of it all. His eyes, the color of dark coffee and just as intense, were locked on hers. She saw a million emotions flicker within them in a single second. Disbelief, confusion, something that looked unnervingly like recognition, but not the one she expected. Not anger. She was prepared for fury, for the cold, clipped dismissal that would cost her the job she so desperately needed. She was prepared to be thrown out like the trash she was paid to collect. Her mouth opened, a pathetic apology already forming on her lips, a desperate plea to explain the unexplainable act of stupidity that had led her here. But before she could make a sound, he spoke. His voice was low, a rough timbered thing that seemed to vibrate through the water, through his hands and directly into her soul. He said 5 words that shattered her reality, 5 words that made no sense and yet changed everything. "It's you. You're my destiny." Her mind fractured. Destiny? What could this man, this billionaire titan who lived in a world of polished marble and silent transactions, possibly mean? It felt like a line from a movie she could never afford to see. The pressure in her chest wasn't just from the shock or the lack of air. It was the terrifying feeling of being seen, truly seen for the first time in years by the one person she was supposed to be invisible to. If you've ever felt like the ground has completely vanished from beneath your feet, leaving you suspended in a terrifying new reality, you know the crushing weight of that moment. So go ahead and hit the like button to show you're here with Clara in the deep end. But to understand how a 23-year-old maid, whose life was a careful ledger of overdue bills and quiet anxieties, ended up soaked and shivering in the arms of a man who was supposed to be a ghost, we have to go back to the beginning of the longest Tuesday of her life. Clara Hayes existed in the quiet, sterile margins of opulence. Her life was a series of silent, repetitive motions. The circular buffing of a floor, the squeak of a clean window, the precise folding of a stranger's $60 socks. She was a ghost in a crisp, ill-fitting uniform, scrubbing away the fingerprints of a life she could only witness through glass. Her world didn't have a scent of its own. It smelled of industrial-grade lemon cleaner and lavender-scented fabric softener. Her reality was a tally of mounting expenses for her mother's long-term care facility back in Oregon, a constant, dull ache of worry that settled deep in her bones, a weariness that came from being perpetually, intentionally invisible. To be a good maid, especially in a place like this, was to be less than a person. It was to be a function, a pair of hands that tidied and then vanished, leaving no trace you were ever there. And for $650 a week before taxes, Clara was an excellent ghost. The Vance estate in Bel Air was her latest assignment, and it was less a house and more a monument to untouchable wealth. It was a sprawling palace of Italian travertine and floor-to-ceiling glass that seemed to float above the haze of Los Angeles. Infinity pools bled into the horizon, lush tropical gardens were manicured with surgical precision, and the silence was the most expensive feature of all, a thick, heavy quiet that swallowed sound. On her first day, the head housekeeper, a severe woman named Mrs. Gable with a mouth permanently pursed in disapproval, had laid out the rules. The primary rule, the one stressed above all others, concerned the owner. "You will never see Mr. Vance," she had stated, her voice as starched as her collar. "He values his privacy above all else. You will have your assignments on this tablet each morning. You will complete them efficiently and silently. You will not deviate from your designated zones. If you believe you hear him approaching, you will find the nearest service closet or exit and make yourself scarce. Is that understood? Clara had nodded, her throat too dry to speak. Julian Vance was a legend in the business world, a tech billionaire known more for his cold-blooded corporate acquisitions and ruthless efficiency than for any sign of a personal life. The tabloids had nothing on him. He was a phantom who demanded absolute perfection, but was never there to witness it, a set of impossible standards on a clipboard. For 3 weeks, Clara had adhered to the rules perfectly. Her goal was simple: remain unseen, collect her meager paycheck, and take the series of buses back to her tiny, sweltering apartment in a less glamorous part of the city, the one where her real life and all its crushing anxieties awaited. But this Tuesday was different. The heat was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket that shimmered over the stone patios and warped the air. Clara was assigned to the West Wing cabanas, a task that involved polishing chrome fixtures until they gleamed and ensuring the stacks of plush, snow-white towels were aligned with geometric perfection. The oppressive silence of the estate was absolute, broken only by the hum of the pool filters and the distant whine of a leaf blower from a neighboring property. Then she heard it, a new sound, one that didn't belong to the house's automated rhythm. It was the sound of running water, not from a sprinkler or a fountain, but a steady, powerful spray, and underneath it, a low, resonant humming. It was a human sound, a man's voice, humming a tune she didn't recognize. It came from the grotto. It was a secluded area at the far end of the main pool, a private alcove cleverly shielded by a dense, living wall of palm fronds, giant ferns, and vibrant hibiscus flowers. A man-made waterfall cascaded over a ledge of dark, mossy stones into this private corner, where an outdoor shower was cunningly built into the rock face. It was designed for the ultimate privacy. It was a place she was forbidden from even looking at. Curiosity. It was an indulgence she could never afford, a reckless impulse that could cost her everything. Her life was about suppressing her own desires, her own thoughts, her own presence. Look down, stay quiet, do the work. That was the mantra that paid for her mother's medication. But the sound was a magnet, pulling her from the sterile safety of her duties. Who was the man behind the leaves? Was it him, the ghost of the mansion? Just one look. The thought was a spark in the dry tinder of her monotonous existence. It was foolish. It was reckless. It was the single most dangerous thing she could do. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. She put down her cleaning caddy, her hands trembling slightly. She crept towards the wall of green, her soft-soled work shoes making no sound on the hot stone. The air here was cooler, damp with mist from the waterfall. The humming was louder now, a relaxed, confident sound. She found a small gap in the foliage, a place where a large, waxy fern leaf could be gently pushed aside. Holding her breath, she leaned in, her world narrowing to that small, forbidden window, and she saw him. Julian Vance was not a phantom. He was a silhouette of raw, undeniable power. He stood under the shower, his back to her, water sluicing over broad shoulders and a taut, muscular back. He was tall, lean, built not with the puffy mass of a bodybuilder, but with the dense, functional strength of an athlete. It was an image of unguarded, private strength, so potent it felt like it physically stole the air from her lungs. She had only ever seen his face in the stark black-and-white professional photos online, where he looked severe and unapproachable. Here, in the golden light, surrounded by water and stone, he was something else entirely. Something real, something dangerous. She was mesmerized, trapped in a moment that felt both profoundly intimate and deeply transgressive. She was watching something she was never meant to see, a glimpse into the life of a modern-day king in his sanctuary. A wave of dizziness washed over her, a cocktail of heat, fear, and a strange, unidentifiable yearning. It was the yearning to be part of a world of such casual beauty, to exist in a place where one could hum in a private waterfall without a care in the world. Lost in the trance, she took a half-step back, a subconscious retreat from the forbidden sight. Her worn-out sneaker, the one with the sole starting to peel away, landed on a loose piece of flagstone at the edge of the manicured garden bed. It wobbled. For a sickening, heart-stopping second, the world tilted on its axis. A startled gasp, loud and sharp, escaped her lips. She flailed, her arms pinwheeling through the air, trying to find purchase on a reality that was slipping away. Her hand brushed against a rough palm frond, but it wasn't enough. With a short, terrified shriek that was swallowed by the sound of the waterfall, she tumbled backward, crashing through the screen of hibiscus and ferns. The fall was a chaotic mess of snapping twigs and torn leaves, ending with a shocking, icy plunge into the impossibly blue water of the main pool. The splash was an explosion in the silent afternoon, a cannonball of pure humiliation. The cold was a brutal shock to her overheated system. She went under, the chlorinated water rushing up her nose, her cheap uniform billowing around her like a pink parachute. She kicked frantically, her limbs tangled and heavy, fighting her way back to the surface. Sputtering, disoriented, and mortified to the core of her being, she broke through the surface, gasping for air. Her first thought was, "I'm fired." Her second was to look toward the grotto. The shower had stopped. The humming was gone. Julian Vance was standing at the edge of the stone ledge, a white towel loosely held in one hand. His face, now turned towards her, was a mask of utter disbelief. He stared at her as if she were an alien who had just fallen from the sky into his private oasis. This was it. The fury, the cold dismissal. But it never came. Instead, his expression shifted. The disbelief was replaced by something else, an intense, focused curiosity. Without hesitation, without a single word, he dropped the towel and dove. His entry into the water was the opposite of hers. It was a sleek, silent knife cut, barely making a ripple. She saw his dark form moving towards her beneath the surface with unnerving speed and grace. He surfaced less than a foot in front of her, his sudden proximity making her flinch. The water lapped between them, a small, turbulent space in the vast, still pool, and then his hands came around her. They were strong and certain, one settling on her waist, the other on her back, lifting her as the water tried to pull her down. She was braced for him to drag her, angry and rough, to the edge. Instead, he simply held her there, treading water with an ease that suggested he was as comfortable here as he was on land. He held her and he looked at her, his eyes searching her face with an unnerving intensity, as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. She was a drowned rat in a stupid uniform, an intruder, a clumsy fool, but he wasn't looking at her like that. He was looking at her like he had been waiting for her. It was in that moment, held in his arms with the California sun blazing down, that he shattered her world with 5 simple words. "It's you. You're my destiny. Destiny." The word hung in the air between them, more shocking than the icy water. It was a word that belonged in fairy tales and old books, not in the sun-drenched, sterile reality of a Bel Air mansion. Clara's mind, already reeling from the fall and the humiliation, simply refused to process it. She stared at him, her brain a frantic scramble of short-circuiting thoughts. Was this a joke? A cruel, elaborate prank played by a bored billionaire on the clumsy Maid? Or worse, was he insane? The thought sent a fresh, sharp spike of fear through her. She was alone, vulnerable, and in the grasp of a man whose power was as vast and incomprehensible as the sky above them. He seemed to read the terror in her eyes. His expression softened almost imperceptibly, the intense focus giving way to something that looked like patience. With a final, decisive movement, he began to tow her toward the wide, shallow steps at the edge of the pool. His grip was firm, but not painful, a silent, non-negotiable command. As they reached the steps, the sound of sharp, clicking heels on stone announced the arrival of Mrs. Gable. She stood at the pool's edge, a black-clad spectre of judgment, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. Her gaze flickered from the dripping, imposing figure of her employer to the pathetic, soaked form of the maid he held, and her thin lips pressed into a bloodless line. Behind her, the 2 other maids stood frozen, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and scandalous fascination. "Mr. Vance, sir," Mrs. Gable said, her voice tight and strained as if she were forcing the words through a sieve of disapproval. "Is everything all right? Shall I call security?" Julian didn't even look at her. His attention was entirely on Clara. He guided her up the steps, the water sluicing from their clothes, creating a spreading dark patch on the pale travertine. He finally released her, and she stood there shivering, wrapping her arms around herself, a desperate and useless attempt to hide her drenched, pathetic form. The borrowed pink uniform felt like a brand of shame. "No, Mrs. Gable," Julian said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that was absolute. He finally turned his head to look at the housekeeper, and the cold power in his gaze made the severe woman flinch. "You will do the opposite. You will prepare the Catalina suite. Immediately." Mrs. Gable's carefully constructed composure cracked. The Catalina suite, sir. For..." Her eyes darted to Clara, dripping a puddle onto the pristine stone, and her disbelief was a palpable insult. The Catalina suite was one of the primary guest suites, reserved for dignitaries and VIPs, a lavish apartment within the mansion that was likely larger than Clara's entire building. "For Miss Hayes," Julian stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned back to Clara. "And find her something to wear, something comfortable." "But, sir, her belongings—" Mrs. Gable began, a frantic edge to her voice. "I don't care about her belongings," Julian cut in, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "I care about her. Go. Now." The dismissal was as sharp and final as the crack of a whip. Mrs. Gable, her face flushed with a mixture of fury and humiliation, gave Clara one last look of pure loathing before turning on her heel and marching away, her rigid posture screaming her silent protest. The other two maids scurried after her like frightened mice. Clara was left alone with him. The silence that descended was somehow more terrifying than the confrontation. He stood before her, water dripping from his chin, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He seemed completely unbothered by his own state, his focus still entirely on her. I am so sorry, sir," she finally managed to stammer, her teeth chattering from a combination of cold and fear. "I don't know what happened. I slipped. I will pack my things. I understand I'm fired. Please, just don't press charges. I need this job, or I needed it." The words tumbled out in a pathetic, desperate rush. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. "You are not fired, Clara," he said, his use of her first name a shocking intimacy. "And you are not leaving." "But I can't stay here," she cried, a note of hysteria creeping into her voice. "I trespassed. I invaded your privacy. I broke every rule." "You broke nothing that matters," he said. He took a step closer, and she instinctively recoiled. "I know you're frightened and confused. I promise you, I will explain everything. But first, you need to get out of these wet clothes." He gestured toward the main house, a silent order to follow. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to flee this bizarre, gilded nightmare. But where would she go? He was Julian Vance. The police would think she was the crazy one. Her feet, feeling like lead weights, slowly began to move, following him into the cool, marble-floored expanse of the house he called home. The Catalina suite was not a room. It was a different dimension. A silent, terrified maid led her through the door into a space that smelled of white tea and money. The living area had a white sectional sofa so large it could host a party for 20, a fireplace carved from a single slab of black marble, and a wall of glass that offered a panoramic view of the Los Angeles skyline. The bedroom contained a bed that looked bigger than her entire apartment, piled high with a mountain of pristine white pillows. But it was the bathroom that truly broke her brain. It was a cavern of veined marble and gleaming chrome, with a walk-in shower large enough to fit a car, and a freestanding bathtub that looked like a sculpture. On the bed, a set of clothes was laid out, a simple pair of grey cashmere sweatpants and a matching soft-knit sweater. Next to them was a silk robe. It felt like a costume for a life that wasn't hers. She stripped off the wet, clinging pink uniform, dropping it onto the floor like a dead thing. Standing under the shower's hot, stinging spray, she scrubbed at her skin as if she could wash away the humiliation, the confusion, the terrifying feeling of being a pawn in a game whose rules she didn't know. The soap smelled of sandalwood and citrus, a scent so luxurious it made her want to cry. When she emerged, wrapped in a towel thicker and softer than any blanket she had ever owned, she felt no better. She was just a cleaner version of the same terrified girl, now trapped in a cage of impossible luxury. She dressed in the borrowed clothes. They were impossibly soft against her skin, a caress she didn't deserve. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed, feeling small and utterly lost. This was a mistake, a terrible, terrifying mistake. Her mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe he had mistaken her for someone else. Maybe he was lonely and eccentric, and this was how he entertained himself. The word he used, destiny, echoed in her head, nonsensical and menacing. A soft knock came at the door. Her heart leaped into her throat. "Come in," she squeaked. Julian entered, now dressed in a simple black t-shirt and dark jeans. He held a tray with 2 steaming mugs. He placed it on a small table near the window and gestured for her to join him. Reluctantly, she did, perching on the edge of an armchair, her entire body tense and ready to bolt. "It's chamomile tea," he said, his voice softer now. "It might help you relax." She took the mug, her hands trembling so hard she was afraid she would drop it. The warmth seeped into her cold fingers. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the distant hum of the city. "I know you have 1,000 questions," he began, his dark eyes fixed on her face. "And I know none of this makes any sense to you." "You're right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It doesn't. I'm not going to hurt you, Clara," he said, and the sincerity in his voice was the most confusing thing of all. He didn't seem like a predator or a madman. He seemed burdened, like a man carrying a heavy weight. "I'm not playing a game. What I said at the pool, I meant it. I've been looking for you." "Looking for me," she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "Why? Who do you think I am? I'm nobody. I clean houses for a living. My mother is in a care facility in Oregon, and I can barely make the payments. That's my life. It's not destiny." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze never leaving her. "Tell me about Oregon. Which town did you grow up in?" The question was so jarring, so out of place, that she could only stare at him. "What?" "The town," he repeated patiently. "What was it called?" "Cedar Creek," she answered automatically, her mind still struggling to catch up. "It's a small town. You've never heard of it." "And your father," he continued, his voice steady. "What was his name?" A pang of old, familiar grief shot through her. "Daniel," she whispered. "Daniel Hayes. He left when I was a little girl." It was a wound that had never properly healed, a story of failure and abandonment that had shaped the course of her and her mother's lives. They never spoke of him. His name was a synonym for shame. Julian's eyes seemed to darken with an emotion she couldn't place. He looked down at his hands for a moment, as if collecting his thoughts, before looking back at her. "I know this is going to sound strange, but everything you've told me is important. More important than you can possibly imagine." Her fear was slowly being replaced by a dizzying, frustrating confusion. What did her deadbeat father have to do with any of this? Her hand, as it often did when she was stressed or thinking of her past, went to her neck, her fingers closing around the small, familiar object that hung there. It was a nervous habit she'd had since childhood, a subconscious need to touch the only thing he'd ever left her. It was a tiny, carved wooden hummingbird, worn smooth with age, hanging on a simple leather cord. It was her most prized possession, the one tangible link to the ghost of a father she barely remembered. Julian's gaze followed the movement of her hand. His eyes, which had been filled with a pensive, searching light, suddenly narrowed. They locked onto the worn piece of wood peeking out from the collar of the sweater. The air in the room changed. The gentle, probing atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a sudden, razor-sharp tension. He stopped breathing. For a full 3 seconds he was completely still, a statue carved from granite. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the calm, patient tone he had been using. It was a low, rough rasp, raw with an emotion so powerful it seemed to physically shake the air between them. "Where?" he said, his voice cracking on the single word. "Where did you get that?" The question, thick with a strange, desperate urgency, hung in the opulent silence of the suite. Clara's fingers tightened instinctively around the small wooden bird. It was a reflex born of a lifetime of protecting the one precious thing she owned, the only relic from a past she couldn't fully grasp. His intensity was a physical force, pressing in on her from across the small table. All her fear, which had momentarily subsided into a dull hum of confusion, came rushing back, sharp and cold. Why did he care about her necklace? It was a worthless trinket, a piece of softened wood. To him, a man who could probably buy a real hummingbird made of diamonds, it should have been invisible. "It was my father's," she said, her voice small and defensive. "He gave it to me before he left." Julian's jaw tightened. He rose from his chair in a single fluid motion, his tall frame seeming to fill the room, shrinking the space between them until it was almost non-existent. He didn't approach her, but his presence was so overwhelming she felt pinned to her seat. He stared at the necklace, not with the curiosity of a stranger, but with the painful, shocking recognition of a man seeing a ghost. It felt as though he wasn't just looking at a piece of wood, but through it, into a history she had never known. "He carved it?" Julian asked, his voice still that raw, tight rasp. I think so," she stammered. "My mom said he was good with his hands. That's all I know." That was the official threadbare story of her father. Daniel Hayes, a man good with his hands who had failed at everything else, and eventually vanished under a cloud of debt and broken promises, leaving his wife and daughter to navigate the wreckage. Julian closed his eyes for a brief, pained moment, and when he opened them again, they were filled with a chaotic storm of emotions. There was grief, regret, and something that looked terrifyingly like rage. But it wasn't directed at her. It was an old, deep-seated anger aimed at something far beyond the confines of this room. Before he could speak again, a sharp, imperious knock echoed from the suite's main door. The sound was a jarring intrusion, a different kind of authority from Julian's quiet, intense power. Julian's head snapped toward the door, his expression hardening into a cold, impenetrable mask. The vulnerability, the raw emotion of a moment ago, was gone, locked away behind a facade of steel. "Excuse me," he said, his voice clipped and formal. He walked to the door and opened it. Standing in the hallway was a woman who seemed to have been sculpted from ice and diamonds. She was impossibly elegant, with blonde hair swept into a perfect chignon, a dress the color of champagne that probably cost more than Clara's annual salary, and a smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating blue eyes. She radiated an aura of entitled power, of a person who had never in her life been told no. "Julian, darling," she said, her voice a smooth, purring sound that grated on Clara's nerves. "Mrs. Gable said you had a situation. I came to see if everything was all right." Her eyes swept past Julian, landing on Clara, who was still perched nervously in the armchair. She took in the sight, the cheap, damp haircut, the borrowed cashmere, the frightened mouse posture, and her polite smile sharpened into a weapon. It was a look of instant, dismissive appraisal, the kind one gives to an insect that has crawled onto a priceless piece of furniture. "Genevieve," Julian said, his voice flat. He made no move to invite her in, his body language a clear, unyielding barrier. "It's handled. It was just a small accident by the pool." Genevieve's perfectly plucked eyebrow arched. An accident, dressed in the Catalina Suite's guest attire. She must be a very clumsy maid to warrant this level of hospitality. The word maid was dripped with condescension, a verbal poison dart aimed directly at Clara. Clara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She wanted the marble floor to open up and swallow her whole. In the presence of this woman, she felt her invisibility cloak, the one she usually wore with a kind of grim pride, become a heavy shroud of inadequacy. "Her name is Clara," Julian said, his voice dangerously low, "and she is my guest." The declaration hung in the air, a direct challenge. Genevieve's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing as she reassessed the situation. She saw Clara not as a clumsy employee, but as something else entirely, an infestation, a threat. "Your guest," Genevieve repeated slowly, drawing out the words. "How charmingly philanthropic of you, darling. But the staff has their own quarters for a reason. Surely this is a breach of protocol." "I decide the protocol in my own home," Julian replied, his patience clearly worn to a thread. "Now, if you'll excuse us, Clara and I were in the middle of a private conversation." It was a dismissal as blunt and final as the one he had given Mrs. Gable. Genevieve's face tightened, the mask of polished politeness slipping to reveal the raw fury beneath. She gave Clara one last withering glare, a silent promise of future conflict, before turning away with a stiff, regal grace. "Of course, darling. We'll speak later." Julian closed the door, the soft click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in the tense silence. He let out a long, slow breath and ran a hand through his damp hair, a gesture of profound weariness. "I apologize for that," he said, turning back to Clara. "That was Genevieve Beaumont, my fiancée." Fiancée. The word landed like a stone in Clara's stomach. Of course he had a fiancée. A woman like that, a woman made of money and power, was his perfect counterpart. It only made Clara's presence here more bizarre, more inexplicable. She was a glitch in his perfect, polished world. "Please, Mr. Vance," Clara pleaded, her voice trembling. "You have to let me go. I don't belong here. I'm causing problems for you, with your staff, with your fiancé. Whatever this is, whatever you think I am, you're mistaken." "I'm not mistaken," he said, his voice regaining its earlier intensity as he walked back towards her. "And don't you understand yet? You belong here more than any of them." His gaze dropped again to the hummingbird necklace. "That proves it." The days that followed felt like a fever dream, a surreal existence in a gilded cage. Julian refused to let her leave, dismissing her apologies and her frantic attempts to explain herself with a calm, unshakable certainty that terrified her. He didn't treat her like an employee who had trespassed, or even as a guest. He treated her like a long-lost treasure, a fragile artifact unearthed by a miraculous accident. He had meals brought to her suite, sent for a doctor to check on her after her fall, and had a personal shopper deliver a wardrobe of clothes so beautiful and expensive she was afraid to touch them. Meanwhile, the mansion staff watched her with a mixture of suspicion and awe. She would catch them whispering in the hallways, their conversations dying the moment she came into view. They looked at her with a new, fearful deference that was almost as uncomfortable as their earlier disdain. Mrs. Gable was the most openly hostile. The head housekeeper saw Clara as nothing more than a conniving opportunist, a gold digger who had staged her fall to ensnare their billionaire boss. Her contempt was a palpable force in the hallways, a cold wave that washed over Clara whenever their paths crossed. Clara spent most of her time hiding in the luxurious prison of her suite, terrified to venture out. She felt like an imposter, a fraud waiting to be exposed. But Julian was persistent. He would visit her each day, asking his strange, probing questions about her childhood. He wanted to know about her mother, her grandparents, any stories she remembered about her father. He listened to her meager, fragmented answers with an unnerving, laser-like focus, as if piecing together a complex puzzle from a handful of broken shards. The tension in the house, already stretched taut, snapped with the return of Genevieve. If her first visit was a warning shot, her second was a declaration of war. She arrived one afternoon while Julian was out, letting herself into Clara's suite with a key she clearly shouldn't have had. "We need to talk," Genevieve said, closing the door behind her. She was dressed in a sharp white power suit, looking like a beautiful predatory shark. Clara stood up, her heart beginning to pound. "I don't think we have anything to talk about." Genevieve let out a small, humorless laugh. "Oh, I think we do. Let's be clear, little girl. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but it's over. Julian has his moments of charity, but they pass. And when this one passes, you will be gone. I'm just here to expedite the process." She walked around the suite, her fingers trailing over the expensive furniture, a gesture of ownership. "I've seen your kind before. You see a man like Julian, and you see a lottery ticket, a clumsy fall into a pool. It's almost insultingly cliché. But you underestimated him, and you certainly underestimated me." "You're wrong," Clara said, a spark of defiance flaring through her fear. "I don't want anything from him. I just want to leave." Genevieve's smile was a slash of red lipstick. "Then leave. The door is right there. No one is stopping you." It was a trap, and they both knew it. If Clara left, it would prove to Julian that Genevieve was right about her. If she stayed, it was a confirmation of her supposed scheme. Seeing Clara's hesitation, Genevieve moved in for the kill. "You see, you don't want to leave. You want the clothes, the food, the attention. But this world will chew you up and spit you out. You don't have the breeding or the strength to survive here." She paused, her eyes landing on a diamond bracelet lying on the dresser, one of the items from the personal shopper that Clara had been too intimidated to even try on. "You know, that's a $20,000 bracelet. A girl like you could solve a lot of problems with that kind of money." The insinuation was clear and ugly. Before Clara could respond, Genevieve swept out of the room, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and quiet menace in her wake. The final act came 2 hours later. There was a loud official knock on the door. When Clara opened it, she was met with the grim faces of Mrs. Gable and 2 stone-faced security guards. "Miss Hayes," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dripping with triumphant malice. "Miss Beaumont has reported a piece of her jewelry missing, a diamond bracelet. She believes she may have left it in here this afternoon. We have been authorized by Mr. Vance to search the room." It was a lie. The bracelet was from the shopper, not Genevieve, but Clara knew it didn't matter. This was a setup, a classic, brutal move to expel the girl who didn't belong. Her blood ran cold. "I didn't take anything," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. "We'll see about that," Mrs. Gable sneered. She and the guards entered the suite. The search was a sham, a piece of theatre. One of the guards walked directly to the small carry-on bag Clara had arrived with, the one containing her few meagre possessions, and upended it onto the pristine white carpet. Her worn T-shirts, a spare uniform, a well-read paperback, and there, glinting amongst the pathetic pile, was the diamond bracelet. It had been planted. Tears of helpless fury and despair welled in Clara's eyes. It was over. No one would believe her. She was the poor maid, the trespasser. She was the obvious thief. "Just as I suspected," Mrs. Gable said, a smug curl to her lips. "You will be escorted off the property. The police will be contacted." The security guards moved toward her, their expressions impassive. A sob caught in Clara's throat. She was going to be arrested. Her life was over. She backed away, her hands raised as if to ward them off. "Leave her alone." The voice came from the doorway, and it was as cold and deadly as the Arctic Sea. Julian stood there, his face a thunderous mask of rage. Genevieve was right behind him, a look of feigned concern on her face that was betrayed by the triumphant glint in her eyes. "Julian, thank goodness," Genevieve said, rushing to his side. "I'm so sorry, darling. I knew she couldn't be trusted. My bracelet." Julian didn't even glance at the bracelet on the floor. He didn't look at Mrs. Gable or the guards. His eyes were fixed on Genevieve, and the look he gave her was terrifying. "I said," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft, "leave her alone." He walked into the room, his presence immediately shifting the balance of power. He walked past the guards, past the weeping, terrified Clara, and stopped in front of a large, abstract painting on the wall. With a flick of a hidden switch, the painting swung away, revealing a dark grey safe. He spun the dial with practiced ease, his movements precise and angry. The safe clicked open. "I've been looking for you for 15 years, he said, his voice raw with emotion. But he wasn't speaking to Genevieve. He was speaking only to Clara. He reached inside the safe and retrieved a small, dust-covered wooden box. He walked back to Clara, his eyes never leaving hers, and held it out to her. Her hands trembled as she took it. It was old, the wood dark and smooth. She lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded, threadbare velvet, was another carved bird. It was a hummingbird, a perfect, identical heartbreaking match to the one hanging around her neck. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two wooden birds, silent witnesses resting in Clara's trembling hands. One was warm from her own skin, polished by years of nervous touches and silent grief. The other was cool and still, a ghost from a sealed tomb. They were identical, not just similar, but a perfect mirror image, carved from the same dark wood, with the same delicate wings, the same impossibly tiny eye. The grain of the wood, the subtle nicks and imperfections, they were a matched pair, two halves of a single forgotten story. A story that was now erupting into the sterile, hostile atmosphere of the Catalina suite. Clara's gaze lifted from the hummingbirds to Julian's face. His eyes were locked on hers, and in their dark depths she saw 15 years of searching, of guilt, of a heavy, inherited burden finally coming to an end. The pieces of the puzzle, the strange questions about her father, the obsessive focus on her necklace, his bizarre and immediate certainty about destiny, it all began to slam into place with the force of a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. Behind them, Genevieve's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. "What is this, Julian?" she demanded, her voice sharp with confusion and a dawning, panicked realization that she had lost control of the narrative. "What is the meaning of this melodrama? She's a thief." Julian turned his head slowly, and the look he gave his fiancée was one of utter, chilling finality. It was the look of a man who had not just been angered, but profoundly betrayed. "The only thief in this room, Genevieve," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "is the one who would frame a desperate girl to protect her own fragile position. But your crime is insignificant. It's a pale imitation of a much larger, much older theft." He turned his back on her completely, a dismissal more profound than any words, and focused entirely on Clara. The security guards and Mrs. Gable stood frozen, forgotten players in a drama that had suddenly escalated far beyond a simple case of stolen jewelry. "My father gave me this," Julian said, his voice softening as he gently touched the hummingbird from the box. "On my 10th birthday. It was the last good day we ever had. He told me it was a promise, a symbol of a partnership that was going to change the world. The story he told then didn't just unravel the mystery, it unraveled Clara's entire life. It took the thin, pathetic narrative she had been told about her father, Daniel Hayes, the failure, the deserter, and set it on fire. The truth, as Julian told it, was a brutal, epic tragedy of friendship, genius, betrayal, and theft on a world-altering scale. Her father, Daniel Hayes, wasn't a failure. He was a brilliant, self-taught artisan and inventor, a visionary who saw the world in patterns and code long before it was fashionable. And he had been the original creative partner of Julian's own father, Alistair Vance. They had met in a garage in the San Fernando Valley, two young, hungry dreamers. Alistair was the businessman, the ruthless negotiator with a gift for raising capital, but Daniel, her father, was the soul of the enterprise. He was the artist, the inventor, the genius who designed the foundational technology, a revolutionary data compression algorithm that would eventually launch the entire Vance tech empire. They were inseparable, Julian said, his voice laced with a bittersweet reverence. My father always said Daniel could make wood and wire sing. They worked for years, pouring everything they had into their project. The hummingbirds. Daniel carved them himself from a single block of ironwood. They were their personal emblems. One for his daughter, Clara, he said, his eyes meeting hers with profound meaning, and one for his partner's son, Julian. They were a symbol of the future they were going to build together, for their families. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. She looked down at the bird she had worn her entire life, not as a memento of abandonment, but as what it was always meant to be, a promise, a birthright. But my father, Julian continued, his voice hardening with a shame that was clearly not his own, was more ambitious than he was honorable. He was ruthless. On the eve of filing their joint patents, the night before they were to become billionaires together, he did the unthinkable. He cut Daniel out completely. The betrayal was swift, surgical, and absolute. Alistair Vance falsified documents, drained their shared business account, and used his network of powerful contacts to launch a vicious smear campaign that professionally and personally destroyed Daniel Hayes. He painted him as unstable, unreliable, a fraud who had contributed nothing of value. Penniless, discredited, and heartbroken by the betrayal of his best friend, Daniel Hayes had simply disappeared. He left his family with nothing but a legacy of shame and a tiny carved wooden bird, too broken to explain the truth of how they had been robbed of not just a fortune, but a future. Alistair Vance, meanwhile, built a global dynasty on that stolen algorithm. The Vance name became synonymous with innovation and power, a gleaming empire built on a foundation of lies and a friend's shattered life. He didn't confess until the very end, Julian said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. On his deathbed, the guilt had consumed him. He made me promise. He begged me to find Daniel's family, to make it right. That was 15 years ago. I've been searching ever since. The search had been a ghost hunt. Daniel Hayes had vanished so completely, wiping his own existence from the map. Julian had hired the best private investigators in the world, spent millions chasing down dead ends, all while running the very empire his father had stolen. He was consumed by the legacy of his father's sin, a debt he felt he could never repay. And then a clumsy maid, a girl with familiar, haunted eyes, had peeked at him showering and fallen into his pool, and with that accidental, chaotic plunge, she had brought the truth of their shared stolen history crashing violently to the surface. He wasn't her destiny because of some mystical, romantic whim. He was her destiny because her very existence was the key to his redemption. She was the rightful heir to the fortune built on her father's stolen dreams. A profound, earth-shattering silence filled the room in the aftermath of the revelation. Clara swayed on her feet, the weight of the new reality pressing down on her. Her entire life, every struggle, every hardship, the constant grinding poverty, her mother's weary sadness, it was all the result of a single, calculated act of betrayal. She wasn't the daughter of a failure. She was the daughter of a king who had been robbed of his kingdom. The spell was broken by a choked, incredulous sound from Genevieve. "This is insane," she breathed, her face pale with shock. "It's a fantasy. You can't possibly believe this servant's fairy tale." Julian turned to her, and for the first time Clara saw the true, terrifying depth of his power. It wasn't in his money or his name. It was in his absolute, unshakable conviction. "Get out," he said, his voice quiet but echoing with the force of a tectonic shift. "Julian, you can't be serious." "I have never been more serious in my life," he interrupted, his eyes like chips of obsidian. He looked at one of the security guards. "Mr. Thompson, please escort Miss Beaumont off the premises. Her belongings will be sent to her. She is no longer welcome in this house, or in my life." The guard, a large man who had been a silent statue until now, blinked once, then nodded. "Yes, Mr. Vance." Genevieve stared at Julian, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. She had played her hand and lost in the most spectacular way imaginable. In her petty, cruel attempt to expel a rival, she had inadvertently triggered the very revelation that had sealed her own fate. With a final look of pure, venomous hatred at Clara, she turned and allowed the guard to lead her from the room, her reign as the queen of the Vance estate over in an instant. Julian then turned his attention to a terrified, white-faced Mrs. Gable. "You are fired," he said, the words falling like stones into the silence. "Clean out your office. Be gone in an hour." There was no room for appeal. Her years of service, her rigid loyalty to the Vance name, meant nothing in the face of her cruelty to the one person who mattered most. Mrs. Gable simply nodded, her face crumbling, and scurried from the room. The second guard, looking deeply uncomfortable, quietly followed. They were alone again. The room which moments before had been a stage for a brutal power play was now a quiet sanctuary. Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, the two hummingbirds still clutched in her hand. The revelation was too vast, too life-altering to fully comprehend. The money, the numbers were meaningless. Half of the Vance empire. It was a concept her mind couldn't even begin to process. What resonated, what echoed in the shattered chambers of her heart was the truth about her father. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been erased. Julian knelt before her, bringing his eyes level with hers. The cold titan of industry was gone, replaced by the man from the pool, the man with the weight of the world in his eyes. "I know this is a lot to process," he said gently. "I know an apology is meaningless in the face of what my father did." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sheaf of folded papers, a thick legal document. He placed it on the bed beside her. "These are for you," he said. "I had my lawyers draw them up years ago in the hope that I would one day find you. They legally acknowledge your father, Daniel Hayes, as the co-founder of Vance Industries. They will clear his name, publicly and permanently, and they transfer 50% of the company's foundational shares into your name. It's what he was owed. It's what you are owed." Clara looked at the papers, the black ink a series of symbols representing a sum of money so vast it felt like a fiction, but she didn't look at them for long. Her eyes were drawn back to the man kneeling before her. He was the son of the monster who had destroyed her family, the man who had reaped the benefits of that monstrous act his entire life. But he was also the one who had spent a decade and a half trying to undo that very wrong, haunted by a promise made to a dying man. The conflict was a raging war inside her. The wealth was a hollow prize compared to the truth, to the restoration of her father's dignity. Her choice was not about accepting the money. It was about whether she could find it in herself to bridge the chasm of betrayal that separated their families. Could she trust the son of the man who had broken her father's heart? Could she find a way to forgive, to build something new from the wreckage of their parents' shared legacy? "It's not the money," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "It was never about the money, it was about him. They took his name, they made him a ghost." "I know," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let me help you give it back to him." The story ended where it began hours later, by the still turquoise water of the pool. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold and rose, the fiery colors reflecting on the water's placid surface. The chaos of the afternoon had subsided, leaving a fragile, uncertain peace. They stood on the edge not as a billionaire and a maid, not as an employer and an intruder, but as two souls bound by a history of profound betrayal and a shared, uncertain hope for the future. The power dynamics of the Vance estate had been completely inverted. She was no longer the invisible servant. She was the ghost of the past made flesh, a living testament to the empire's original sin. He didn't make a grand declaration of love. He didn't ask her to marry him or promise her a life of ease. He offered her something far more difficult and far more meaningful. He stood before her, the last rays of sunlight catching the earnest, pleading look in his eyes. He held out his hand, not in command, but in a gesture of pure, vulnerable invitation. "Help me build a legacy our fathers would have been proud of," he said. "Help me turn this company, built on a lie, into something that honors the man my father betrayed. Help me make it right." His outstretched hand hung in the space between them. It was a bridge across a chasm of pain. Taking it would mean stepping away from the simple, painful clarity of her old life and into a future that was terrifyingly complex and uncertain. It would mean choosing to trust, choosing to forgive, choosing to build. As the first stars began to prick the darkening California sky, she looked from his hand to his face, and for the first time since she fell into his world, she saw not a billionaire, not a symbol of power, but just a man asking for a chance at redemption. And slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in his, choosing not a storybook ending but a difficult, hopeful beginning. Her hand in his felt both impossibly fragile and incredibly solid, a small point of contact in a world that had tilted off its axis. The warmth of his skin was a grounding reality in the surreal twilight. For a long moment, they just stood there, the silence between them filled with the unspoken weight of 2 lifetimes of loss and misunderstanding. The setting sun bled the last of its color from the sky, and the cool evening air began to settle over the manicured gardens, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine. This was it, the beginning. But beginnings, Clara was quickly learning, were not gentle, easy things. They were violent, seismic shifts that left you breathless and disoriented in a new, unfamiliar landscape. Julian's thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles, a gesture so gentle and tentative, it seemed at odds with the immense power he wielded. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond gratitude. It was the sound of a man who had carried a crushing weight alone for 15 years and had just felt someone offer to share the load. The next morning, the Vance estate felt like a different world. The oppressive, sterile silence had been replaced by a low hum of nervous energy. The staff, who had once looked through Clara as if she were made of glass, now averted their eyes, their faces a mixture of fear, respect, and a burning, unanswered curiosity. Mrs. Gable was gone, her severe presence erased as if she had never existed. Genevieve Beaumont, once the undisputed queen of this domain, was now just a ghost of a memory, a cautionary tale whispered in the service corridors. Clara Hayes, the clumsy maid from Oregon, was now the center of this strange new universe, and the gravity of her position was terrifying. Julian was a man transformed. The brooding, phantom-like figure of the mansion was replaced by a man of decisive, focused action. He didn't insulate Clara from the fallout. He included her in every step, treating her not as a damsel in distress to be protected, but as the partner he had claimed she was. Their first meeting was in his home office, a vast, intimidating room with floor-to-ceiling windows, shelves filled with leather-bound books, and a desk that looked like it had been carved from the deck of a battleship. A team of stern-faced lawyers in $1,000 suits were already assembled, their leather briefcases lined up with military precision. "Gentlemen," Julian said as they entered, his hand resting lightly on the small of Clara's back, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of unity and protection. "This is Clara Hayes. As of this morning, she is, by legal and moral right, the co-owner of Vance Industries." A ripple of controlled shock went through the room. The lawyers, men trained to mask all emotion, couldn't hide the flicker of surprise in their eyes. They looked at Clara, dressed in another set of borrowed designer clothes that felt like a costume, and their professional minds were clearly racing, trying to compute this impossible new variable. "The documents you prepared 15 years ago are to be executed immediately," Julian continued, his voice leaving no room for debate. "And we have work to do. The first order of business is a press release, a full, unvarnished statement correcting the historical record of this company's founding. Daniel Hayes will be publicly named and celebrated as the co-founder and chief architect of our core technology. Alistair Vance will be accurately portrayed." The lead counsel, a silver-haired man named Marcus Thorne, cleared his throat. "Mr. Vance, Julian, a move like that will be catastrophic for the stock. Admitting that the entire foundation of the company is based on intellectual property theft, the markets will panic. It could wipe out billions in value overnight." "I'm aware," Julian said calmly, "but this company's value was never just monetary. It was built on a friendship. It was supposed to be a testament to what 2 brilliant minds could build together. My father corrupted that vision. We," he said, looking at Clara, are going to restore it. The money is just paper. The truth is the only asset that matters now. Draft the statement." Clara sat through the meeting in a daze, listening to them discuss numbers that were so large they sounded like astronomical distances. They talked about share dilution, board resolutions, and SEC filings. It was a language from another planet, but through it all she clung to one phrase: the truth is the only asset that matters. For 23 years, her life had been defined by a lie. Now this man, this stranger to whom she was inextricably bound, was proposing to burn down his own empire just to tell the truth. As the days turned into a week, Clara began to see the man behind the myth. Julian was relentless, working with a ferocious intensity that was both inspiring and intimidating. But with her, he was different. In the quiet moments, after the lawyers and executives had gone, he would seek her out. They would walk through the gardens or sit by the pool where their worlds had collided. He didn't push her to talk about the business. Instead, he asked about her father. "What was he like?" he asked one evening, as they sat on a stone bench overlooking the glittering sprawl of Los Angeles. Clara clutched her hummingbird necklace. "I don't really know," she confessed, the admission a familiar ache in her chest. "I only have flashes. The smell of sawdust, the feel of his scratchy beard when he'd kiss me goodnight, the sound of him humming, just like you were at the pool." Julian's head turned sharply towards her. "He hummed?" "All the time," my mum said. "When he was working on things in his workshop, she said the happier he was, the more he hummed." A look of profound, sorrowful understanding passed over Julian's face. "My father told me. He said the last time he ever saw Daniel, the day before the betrayal, they were in the garage putting the final touches on the algorithm, and Daniel was humming. He said he never heard a man sound so hopeful. The shared detail, so small and so human, was like a bridge across time. It made her father feel real to her in a way he never had before. He wasn't just a sad story. He was a man who hummed when he was happy, a man on the verge of a brilliant future." For the first time, Clara felt a flicker of genuine anger towards Alistair Vance, an anger that was entirely her own, separate from Julian's inherited guilt. He hadn't just stolen an invention. He had stolen her father's hope. He had stolen his song. Their strange shared grief and purpose began to forge a bond between them, a fragile intimacy that was both comforting and terrifying. Clara found herself watching him, noticing the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was stressed, the way his eyes would light up when he talked about a new piece of technology, the deep well of sadness that seemed to permanently reside behind his controlled facade. She was starting to see him not as a billionaire or a savior, but as a man trapped by his own legacy, as much a prisoner of the Vance name as she had been a victim of it. But the outside world was not going to let them exist in their quiet bubble of shared purpose. The day the press release went out, the world exploded. The story was a media firestorm, a scandal of epic proportions that dwarfed any of Genevieve's petty dramas. Vance empire built on lies, tech titan's father accused of decades-old theft, mystery heiress emerges. The headlines were sensational, brutal, and relentless. The company's stock plummeted, just as Marcus Thorne had predicted. Paparazzi helicopters started circling the estate like vultures, their cameras like hungry eyes trying to get a glimpse of the Maid who had brought down a dynasty. The pressure was immense. Clara, who had spent her life cultivating invisibility, was now one of the most famous women in the world. Her old life was gone, incinerated in the blaze of the media spotlight. Her picture was everywhere, a grainy, unflattering photo dredged up from her high school yearbook. Reporters descended on her mother's care facility in Oregon, harassing the staff and trying to get a comment from a woman who was too lost in the fog of her own illness to understand what was happening. Julian was furious. He hired a top-tier security firm to protect the facility and moved Clara's mother to a private, more secure location, handling everything with a quiet, ruthless efficiency. But he couldn't protect Clara from the psychological toll. One night, overwhelmed by the flashing cameras and the screaming headlines, she broke down. She was in her suite, staring at a tablet showing a news report that painted her as a brilliant, manipulative gold digger who had masterminded the entire situation. The comment section was a sewer of vitriol, calling her a liar, a fraud, a homewrecker. A sob tore from her chest, a raw, ragged sound of despair. She was drowning. The door to her suite opened quietly. Julian stood there, his face etched with concern. He had clearly heard her. He walked over and gently took the tablet from her hands, shutting it off. "Don't read that," he said softly. "It's poison." "They think I'm a monster," she wept, wrapping her arms around herself. "They think I planned this, that I'm just like Genevieve. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am just a fraud, wearing these clothes, living in this house." "Don't you ever say that," he said, his voice fierce. He knelt in front of her, just as he had the day he'd revealed the truth, and took her hands in his. "You are the least fraudulent person I have ever met. You are the truth, the one piece of it that matters in all of this." His hands were warm and strong around hers. "Clara, look at me." She lifted her tear-streaked face to his. His dark eyes were burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with business or revenge. It was something else, something personal and deeply vulnerable. "This is hard," he said, "harder than I ever imagined, but we are going to get through it together. I made a promise to my father to find you and make things right, but I'm making a new promise now, to you. I will not let them destroy you. I will not let them tarnish your father's name or yours. I will protect you." In that moment, the last of her defenses crumbled. The fear, the suspicion, the chasm between their two worlds, it all seemed to dissolve in the raw sincerity of his vow. He wasn't just fixing his father's mistake. He was fighting for her. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean on him, to draw strength from his certainty. She wasn't just an heir to a fortune. She was a partner in a battle. Their relationship shifted that night. The quiet, tentative friendship deepened into something more profound. The lines between their shared mission and their personal feelings began to blur. They started working side by side in his office, Clara's quiet, insightful questions often cutting through the legal jargon to the heart of an issue. She had her father's intuition, a natural grasp of the elegant logic that underpinned the technology. She wasn't just a symbol, she was becoming a true partner. One evening they were working late, poring over Daniel's old rediscovered notebooks, which Julian's investigators had finally located in a dusty storage unit. The pages were filled with her father's elegant handwriting, complex equations interspersed with brilliant, innovative ideas that were decades ahead of their time. Tucked into the back of one of the journals was a faded photograph. It was of a young Daniel Hayes, his arms slung around a young, smiling Alistair Vance. They were standing in a cluttered garage, beaming with a pride and hope that was almost painful to look at. "They look so happy," Clara whispered, her finger tracing the outline of her father's young, unlined face. "They were," Julian said, his voice heavy. "They were going to be kings." Clara looked up from the photograph to Julian. He was watching her, his expression unguarded, the ever-present sadness in his eyes momentarily replaced by a look of raw, unshielded emotion. The vast office felt small, intimate. The world outside, with its reporters and its stock market and its scandals, ceased to exist. There was only the two of them, the ghosts of their fathers, and the undeniable magnetic pull that had been there since the moment he'd pulled her from the water. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. His touch was electric, sending a shiver through her entire body. "Clara," he breathed, his voice barely audible. It was no longer about justice. It was no longer about redemption or legacies. It was about the man and the woman they were right now in this room. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, but she didn't. She couldn't. She leaned in to meet him, her eyes fluttering shut, choosing not a business partner, not a protector, but the man who had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning.